Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the El Restaurante webinar about Mexican wine. I'm Ed Avis, the publisher of El Restaurante, and joining me today is Jill Gubesch, the wine director of Topolobampo, Frontera Grill, Lina Brava, Bar Sotno, and other Rick Bayless restaurants in Chicago. Jill is an award-winning sommelier and has been an advocate for Mexican wines for years. She has been with that company since 2001. If you have questions during today's presentation, you can use the questions tab on your screen to put those questions out, and we will answer them at the end. But don't wait until the end. Go ahead and put your questions out whenever. Okay, before we get to Jill, I will speak briefly about the business side of Mexican wines. It's a topic that I love to talk about. At El Restaurante magazine, we really began to focus on Mexican wines 4 years ago when we started hearing that they were of higher quality than before. And some people made the point that supporting the Mexican wines would help the economy of that country, which is something we are concerned about. But most of all, since our readers are owners of Mexican and other Latin cuisine restaurants, we were happy to report to them about the quality of Mexican wines and the opportunities that those wines give to their restaurants. So one of the first things people ask me when I bring up Mexican wine is quality. As you all know, quality is determined by many factors, ranging from the ingredients, like the grapes and the water, to the skill and the facilities of the winemaker. And of course, the quality and characteristics of the grapes are affected by where they are grown. On your screen, you can see a map of the wine growing regions of Mexico. If you know your geography, you will see that most of Mexico is below the 30th parallel, which is considered the boundary for successful vineyards. But Mexico is arid, which is good for grapes, and the altitudes of the vineyards in most cases are high. So you have a good shift of temperature between day and night, which is also favorable for grapes. On this slide, you can see some of the major grapes grown in Mexico. The graphic is a little out of date, but it gives you an idea of the variety of grapes. There are more than 100 different grapes grown in Mexico. Not all of them well, but many of them very well. And of course, the quality of the wine depends on the winemaker. Mexico has been making wine for centuries. Casa Madero, for example, has been making wine since 1597. So there's a deep history of winemaking in the country. More recently, a number of winemakers have come from Europe or trained in Europe and brought that expertise to Mexico starting in the 1970s. And then in the last 20 years ago or so, a real wine craft industry has blossomed in Baja, California. And many of these winemakers are using the latest technologies to create really fine wines. Baja now accounts for 57% of the total Mexican wine production. So in terms of skill and technology, Mexico has that today. There are about 2,900 wineries in Mexico, and they contribute about $250 million US to the economy of that country each year. Now let me tell you just a little bit about a few of the winemakers that I'm familiar with. By all means, this is not a comprehensive list, but it gives you a little bit of the flavor of who is making wine in Mexico today. Perhaps one of the best well-known is Hugo de Costa. He was born in Mexico City, trained in winemaking in France, and owns Casa de Piedra and several other wineries. He formed La Escuelita, a winemaking school, in the 1970s, and he's considered a true pioneer. He also leads Viva, Vinos y Vinedos Actuales, which is a coalition of wineries. Another well-known winemaker is Camillo Magoni. He was born and trained in Italy, came to Mexico 50 years ago to make wine for L.A. Chetto, and now makes his own wine, Casa Magoni. He wrote a well-known book, The History of Vine and Wine in the Baja California Peninsula. He's known for being very helpful to other winemakers. Somewhat younger is Lulu Martinez Ojeda. She was born in Mexico, but worked for 10 years in France, learning the craft. A French winemaker named Henry Lurton created a winery in Baja California and made her the head winemaker. She's considered an edgy, modern winemaker, and she's known for her amber wines, often called orange wines, which are white wines but colored by some extended grape skin maceration. And finally on this screen is Alberto Rubio. He's the chief winemaker for Bodega F. Rubio, a family business that's only about 5 years old. They're known for their blends of Cabernet, Merlot, Malbec, and several other blends. Blending is a big thing in Mexico. On this next slide are some of the wineries in Mexico that are succeeding. This is just a very small number of them, of course, but let me just briefly tell you about some of these. On the left of your screen there, you see Casa Madero. It's the oldest winery in North America and one of the largest. They have a growing distribution in the US. They are located in north central Mexico near Monterrey. They have about 315 hectares under cultivation and planting more. They're best known for their Malbec and their blends, such as 3V, which is a blend of Cabernet Franc, Cabernet Sauvignon, and Shiraz. Next on that screen there is Monte-Genic. It's another wine that is reasonably well known in the US. That winery started in 1987 and has 80 hectares under cultivation. They're located in the Baja. They make quite a range of wines. Their highest rated, again, are blends. Another wine with broad US distribution, fairly broad at least, is L.A. Chetto. It's probably got the broadest distribution. It's an older winery founded in 1928 and has 1,200 hectares in cultivation. It's known for their Syrah, Malbec, and some blends. And then the last two wineries on this screen are somewhat smaller. There's Vinícola Torres Alegre, a very small winery in the Baja, but with a good reputation. We had some friends over and we tried a kind of a range of wines, Mexican wines last fall, and one of theirs, their Vino Blanco, was among theirs. And the group liked it. They rated it 7 out of 10. And finally on this slide is Lomita, another small winery in the Baja. When we tried their wine, we tried their Discreto Encanto, and that ranked 8 out of 10. This winery is very inventive with their labels, as you will see if you explore them. Okay, I just want to touch on a couple developments on the business side that are going on in Mexico right now in the wine industry. In 2016, so 3 years ago, Mexico rejoined the Organización Internacional du la Vigne et du Vin, the International Organization of Wine and Vine. Mexico had been absent from that organization for 7 years, so it was a good move forward. This organization promotes the idea of creating rules for marketing and international cooperation, and it deals with standardized labeling. So it's a good thing that Mexico has rejoined that group. Next, in May of 2018, so about a year ago, The general law to promote the wine producing industry was passed by the lower house of Mexico's Congress. This law will hopefully lead to the development of a government commission to support the industry. It's also promoting research into different varietals suitable for cultivation and driving the development of better agricultural practices to develop and promote wine tourism. Also, there will be a precise definition of what can be legally labeled as vino mexicano, meaning all the grapes will have to be grown in Mexico itself. And finally, last little recent development, again last May, a new promotional campaign was launched called Todos Unidos por el Vino Mexicano, Everyone United for Mexican Wine. This campaign will be carried out by the Mexican Winemakers Council and supported by a federal grant. It will hope to cultivate greater knowledge about the varietals that Mexico produces and highlight the qualities of local wines. One other item is just last September, the government announced a project to create better irrigation in the Valle de Guadalupe and Baja. So that should help those wineries there. Now let me just touch on distribution briefly. Obviously, distribution is essential to Mexican wines, to any wine for restaurant sales. Some restaurants can afford to buy a case or two directly through an importer, and that's fine, but most places would rather order through a distributor, and that's rather difficult right now. Casa Madero, which we touched on before, is available through Southern Glazers, and that's very important. I recently spoke with Mike Glazer, who is the wine guy there, and he told me they are distributing Casa Madero in California, Texas, Arizona, Colorado, Illinois, and Oklahoma. So their distribution is decent and growing. For those of you who aren't unfamiliar with how wines get into distribution, each state has its own laws. So even big distributors like Glazers need to maneuver those laws in order to carry a product. Importers are just one step in the chain, but distributors are really the next step up the food chain. So it's very important for a wine to have good distribution. The 4 importers listed on this screen, as you can see, all do carry some decent selection of Mexican wines. Okay, so there are some challenges in the big picture of Mexican wine. Price is a challenge. Mexican food in general has a perception of being kind of a value product in many places, but Mexican wine, it can be very expensive to import, so it can be challenging to charge $15 for a glass of wine. But as Mexican food, as people become more familiar with high quality, fine dining Mexican food, that situation should change. And even in family restaurants where premium margaritas are on the rise, then that can easily cost $15. So it's not a far leap to think that a glass of wine could be sold for the same amount. But nevertheless, about 65% of the Mexican restaurants that we follow are considered family dining, where price is definitely an issue, and they probably cannot afford to carry very good quality Mexican wines at this time. Also, as we know, our own government has been threatening tariffs on Mexican products, which won't help anything, but the Mexican government itself imposes a tax based on alcohol content that adds quite a high fee to wines coming out of Mexico. So there's an issue there. That law that I mentioned before hopefully will change that. Some people say that should drop about 17%, which obviously would help. Nevertheless, the whole problem can't be based on just taxes. Some winemakers in other parts of the world are simply more efficient, and that too. Another challenge, interestingly, is quantity. Mexicans are starting to drink more of their own wine, and production has not really kept up proportionately. So as there's less available for export. And many of the wineries in Baja are small craft wineries with their own restaurant or hotel, and that wine is consumed right there on the premises. Furthermore, increasing production takes time. Mike Glazer told me that Madero is planning 75 more hectares in anticipation of expanding their U.S. sales, but it takes 4 years for vines to begin producing. And finally, perhaps the biggest challenge for Mexican wine in the U.S. is the lack of a good reputation. That's one thing that we've been trying to change here at El Restaurante with our articles on the topic, and many restaurants have been working to change by serving good wines. So with that, I'm going to turn to our featured speaker today. That's Jill Gubesch. Jill, are you there?
Yes, I am. Hi,
Great.
good morning.
Well, welcome, Jill. We're so happy to have you with us. Jill, I'm going to ask you some questions, and you can answer them. And then, as I mentioned at the beginning, if you're an attendee and you have further questions for Jill or for me, please use that questions tab to forward questions to me, and we will answer them at the end. Okay, Jill, first question. When and how did you discover Mexican wines?
Well, back when I started working for Rick and Deanne Bayless, I had never tasted any Mexican wine. And so back in 2001, we went to the Harvest Festival. So they have during August, during harvest in the Valle, they have what they call La Fiesta de la Vendimia, and it's in Ensenada. And most of the wineries, in fact, I think all of the wineries participate. Back in 2001, however, there were maybe 15 wineries at the time in Valle de Guadalupe. Fast forward to today, there's over 120 different wineries in the Valle in the surrounding valleys. So it's broken down into 5 different valleys, all considered part of the Valle de Guadalupe region. And so it's really interesting and exciting to see the growth that has happened in that region. But back then, there were a handful of wineries I felt like were really making great wine. And so I got very excited realizing the potential of the region and tasting the quality of the wines. Back then, like I said, there were maybe a handful of those wineries that I would use. Today, the consistency level, the quality, and even the availability has gotten so much better. But going down there to visit was just an eye-opener. I went with Rick and Deanne Bayless right when they hired me. But it's also a very fun time for anyone who hasn't been to the Valle to visit during this festival, because they have events where all of the wineries are represented in one place. So you don't have to drive to all these down these small dirt roads to get to all these different wineries. If you go to the festival, it runs. I think this year it's going to be from August 2nd to the 18th, and they do a series of different tastings and parties and concerts. So it's a lot of fun, as well as a lot of great research can happen if you're not familiar with the wineries.
That's great. Jill, can you repeat the name of that festival?
It's Las Fiestas de la Vendimia.
Okay.
They would pronounce it Vendimia, but Vendimia, it's basically the parties of the harvest.
Great.
Is the translation in English.
Thank you. So attendees, I will later post a link to information about that, so you can learn more about that. Okay, next question, Jill. Maybe you kind of answered this in your first answer, but what prompted you to serve Mexican wine at Frontera or Topolobampo?
Well, I mean, with the style of cuisine that we serve, of course, it was something that I really was eager to do, because I feel like Mexican wines work so beautifully with the cuisine. And in Lobampo, we also offer a tasting menu with wine matches. And so I really wanted some of those matches to be, wines from Mexico. Um, so the first wines I tasted that I realized really they were really doing something special there were Ugo de Costa from Casa de Piedra, which you mentioned him earlier. He was really at the forefront of raising the bar of quality in the Valle. And I tasted his unoaked Chardonnay, the Piedra de Sol, and fell in love with it. Um, After I met him, he was also at that time making the wines for Adobe Guadalupe, which was owned by Don and True Miller. Don has since passed, but True has taken over, and they were also making amazing wine. And so I invited them to do a wine dinner with us at Frontera and Topolo. Back in that time, no Mexican wines were really being brought into Chicago outside of LA Cheto and Monte Chinique, which I think are the two brands that most people in the U.S. have known for a number of years. And so I felt like the only way to get these wines from these smaller producers, these boutique wineries, was to invite them into our restaurants and to let them see what it is that we did with our food and with the respect for Mexican culture. And then hoping that after they saw that, that they would be willing to sell us some of their very, very limited amount of wine, because that was the initial challenge back then, was the very, very limited quantities. They really didn't have any interest back then to sell to the U.S. because they didn't need to. They were selling all their wine already. So I invited Ugo and Don and True Miller, and we did a wine dinner. And they saw that we served authentic Mexican food, and that was the beginning of getting the wines into our restaurants. It was still a process because back then no one was importing any of the boutique wines. And so it was asking a favor of a favor of a favor and using some of the local distributors that are good relationships with our restaurants, and then getting them to help me clear the wines to get them in legally. So it was really a case by case study at first. But they were just so beautiful with our food that I just had to find a way to do it.
That's great. Thank you, Jill. Let me ask a follow-up. That you mentioned that the wines were beautiful with your foods, and can you explain a little bit why it matters that the food and wine come from the same region, or at least generally? Is that does that help the pairing if the cuisine and the wine share a an area of the world of origin?
I mean, it really does help in knowing that when you have a list of wines from Mexico, we have an entire feature page actually of Mexican wine, that you can almost go in blindly and order a bottle and sort of realize that it's going to go with most of the food on the table. I think that stands to reason. That being said, in my years at Topolo, uh, I've found that exploring the world of wine with Mexican cuisine is really something else. Like, I used to think, oh, different delicate wines or this style of wine or that style of wine maybe wouldn't work with Mexican cuisine. Well, over the years, I've proved that wrong because every time I think of a wine that may not work with our food, the chef will come up with an amazing dish, and all of a sudden I'll be using a wine I thought maybe wasn't in the portfolio of things I could use. But when you're talking about just not really having to think about it and something that's a natural pairing, then absolutely the Mexican wines, it's just they go with so much of the cuisine. I think it's the terroir, the people, the whole package and how they're made. And they really are unlike wines from anywhere else in the world. When we look at different varieties from Mexico, say, just for example, Cabernet Sauvignon, it seems that the tannins are a little rounder and softer than Cabernet from other places. You get a sense of the terroir for sure. In some instances, it may be a little note of salinity or that mineral that is in the water there, in the soil there. But I think those characteristics are one of the reasons that they work so well with Mexican cuisine.
Hey, Jill, we're
Because
losing you a
typically,
little bit here.
alrighty, is it the volume or?
Oh, now you're back. Thank you.
Okay, okay.
Okay. You were just
I
talking
think
about the salinity a little bit, little mineral taste.
yes, and I think that really is one of the things that goes so well with certain dishes. I think that the fact that a lot of the reds in other places, if Cabernet is grown in other places, many times it can have a lot of tannin, where the Mexican cabs tend to be softer in tannin. And I feel like really super tannic wines sometimes aren't the best match with flavors that we use. When you're talking about the chiles in the sauces, um, the tannin in a big strong tannin in a wine kind of pose those deep red chile flavors and sometimes even bring out heat or tannin in the flavor of the chile itself. Whereas if the tannins are softer and more round, they tend to pair more with the fruit of the chile because chiles, the dried red chiles that are used so much in our food are a part of the fruit family. And so when you make a sauce well, you're getting that fruit flavor of the chile and the flavor profile of the red chile, and it can pair beautifully with different flavor profiles you'll find in wine. For example, the pasilla chile has espresso notes, bittersweet chocolate, um, and can have a little tannin and also what we call building heat, where the more you eat it, the hotter it gets. And you think about wine flavors that have dark chocolate or, you know, espresso notes, and you can pair that with that chile or guajillo, which has kind of these bright red fruity notes and it has kind of a forward heat and good acidity. Then you think about wines that have like red cherry, red raspberry, and so matching the flavor profiles to the flavors of the chiles has worked really beautifully in choosing the right wines to go with the food. And if those grape types are from Mexico, then it's just a natural pairing.
Mhm. Great. Jill, that leads me to another question. When you are considering wines, are you coming to Chef Bayless or whoever is in the kitchen with a wine and saying, "Hey, let's create a dish for this," or vice versa? Or is
Oh,
it
vice
kind
versa.
of a back and forth?
Well, I mean, we work very closely together. I work very closely with the chefs. However, it's their brainchild. It's their idea for the menu theme, for the dishes. We at all of our locations, we change the menu every 4 weeks.
Okay.
And so not maybe the entire menu, but we'll circulate in and out different seasonal ingredients and things. We change a good portion of the menu in all of our locations on a monthly basis. And sometimes it's based around a theme or a region. For example, in Topolobampo, we have 3 different tasting menus. One is the classics, one is seasonal, and one we call the Perfect Seven. And the Perfect Seven is always based on a theme. In fact, beginning in July, we're going to be doing a Baja menu, and I'm hoping at that time to have enough availability of all of the Mexican wines that it can be entirely paired with Mexican wine. So I'm super excited about that. But to try to tie in with their theme, I will come up with the wine to match their dish. That being said, uh, they're very, very flexible. So sometimes if a dish goes better with a red than a white, we might flip the order of courses or something like that. But I generally try to search until I find the right wine to match that dish because that's my role. And also, they're very good about tasting with the wine. And so they create the menu. And then we have a meeting where I bring different wines and they bring the dish and we taste all together. I pair the wine and I taste it with the chef because I don't want to change their dish, you know. So if a wine isn't too impactful or maybe changing the flavor or the idea of the dish, I want to hear from them if they would rather have me, you know, maybe choose something more delicate or, you know, back down on this or that. So it's definitely a collaborative, a team process. But I would never have them change a dish just to make it work with the wine, because they have such a vision in their menu writing that I would never like to interrupt that. I'd like to highlight it more than you know, make demands.
Great. Okay. Do you have some favorites among the Mexican wines that you offer?
It's such a tough question because I love so many of the wines and have become so close with a lot of the winemakers and wineries down there that they're really considered friends. You mentioned I like to go by the winemaker because they have so many smaller boutique wineries now that many of these winemakers are making wine for other places as well. Um, so you had mentioned Lulu, who actually was making wine in Bordeaux. She's from Ensenada originally. That's where her family is from. And she was making wine at Lurton's property in Bordeaux for over 10 years at Brain Cantenac in Margaux. And she makes wines not only for Bodega Henri Lurton in Baja, but she also makes Bruma, which is really awesome wine. That's a relatively new winery. Um, and so the labels she makes wines for are also really great. You had mentioned Alberto Rubio, and he also makes wines for Fluxus and Malagon, which is really great. Malagon actually has some more affordable wines as well to take note. And Joe Malagon, the owner, is there and lives on the property. They have some very, very old vines of Grenache or Garnacha, as they would say there. Ugo da Costa, as I mentioned, really set the bar and helped train winemakers in the challenges of the region, because the Escuelita that he started, it's not a full winemaking program, but more to have winemakers come and get together and understand the challenges and conditions of making wine in that region. And so many of those winemakers that came through that program are some of my favorites. Like Alberto Rubio, I know went there for a little while, and also Danielle Longberg, who is the winemaker for Adobe Guadalupe, which I mentioned. Adobe Guadalupe is a really special place and a really fun place to visit as well. Each of the wines is named after a different archangel, and True has stables there, so you can go horseback riding. They're making some mezcal there as well as beer, so it's a fun place to. You can stay at the hacienda there, and it's just a beautiful property, and the wines are really great. And back in '01, that was one of the wineries that we represented. Also, talking about the blends, I think that's one of the super interesting things they do in Mexico is blend varieties that you might not normally see together in one bottling. And I actually do a little bit of a private label wine blend for our restaurant called Topolo Vino. And the first one I did in Mexico was actually with Adobe Guadalupe. And so they hold a special place in my heart as well. But Danielle Longberg also makes wines for MFA. Litoral is another label that he makes wine for, and all of those wines are really great as well.
Excellent. Thank you.
Oh, and of course, Camilo Magoni. I can't forget Camilo. Camilo Magoni is like the king of the Valle. And Casa Magoni, I think you can find some pretty good value there as well. Because price is definitely a thing. They have so many taxes, so the price per bottle, once it gets actually to Chicago on a 3-tier system, there's so many markups involved. But I find that the Magoni wines, he still has some price points that are amazing, because he started planting vineyards for his own project back when he used to work for Cheto. So he was the winemaker at LA Cheto for more than 40 years, but all the time planting his own vineyards. And he was making his own wine for family and friends starting in '02 from his property. And then in 2013, he finally established the label Casa Magoni, and then those wines were available to us. But his project is super interesting because in the Magoni vineyards alone, he has over 110 different varieties that he experiments with. So that's a really incredible thing. He's got really unique blends and different wines that he does. He's doing like a Fiano blend that we carry. He does a Chardonnay Vermentino blend. So they're not necessarily grapes you see that often in the Valle, and they're really great wines.
Excellent. Jill, you touched on a topic that I would like you to explore just a little bit more, and that is distribution. In my part of our presentation today, I touched on it, and on the screen there were the names of a few. But who do you use that perhaps some of other El Restaurante readers might be able to access?
So I think since we're talking about people all throughout the U.S., that you have to really think about the importers and then track the wines down through the importer. So Michel Martin is probably the person that has been bringing in these Mexican wines the longest into the U.S., and her import company is called LMA Wines,
Hey,
and she
Jill.
does have a website.
Okay.
Um, then I think you posted several as well, Ed. Truly Fine Wines, which is located in San Diego, and he does have an online presence as well. Then Jose Pastor is bringing in the Beachy wines, and that's a biodynamic property located in Tecate. They have some very old vineyards in Tecate, and it's Jair and Noel Tellez and their mother. Very small project and very unique wines. They specialize in indigenous varieties. They're doing some mission grape. They have one bottling that's a mystery grape. It's a field blend. But Jose Pastor, I think, is throughout the U.S. And then one of the newer importers is Tom Bracamontes, and his company is called La Competencia. Then I think some of the larger brands are brought in by Southern, which I think they represent Casa Madera, which is a different valle. That's the Parras Valley, which is located in the state of Coahuila.
Great. Thank you, Jill. And
You're welcome.
Jose Pastor, is that the name of his importer company also, or is there
Yes,
a
he has
different?
a great website.
Okay.
He has a very good website. But I think the only brand he represents right now from Mexico is Beachy.
Okay. Okay, great. And Jill,
Then for
when?
Chicagoans, there's only
Yeah.
one local distributor that's doing the boutique wines in Chicago, and that is Bowden Street. Susan Van Knet is the owner. And she's bringing in both the LMA wines and the La Competencia wines.
Okay, great. Thank you.
You're
Jill,
welcome.
you mentioned the fact that at Topolobampo you do the courses paired with wines. Is that the primary way that you introduce wines to customers, and or are there other ways when you bring in a new wine, or you learn that a customer is interested in learning? How do you introduce them?
There's several ways. I find the pairings in Topolo are really popular. Over 50% of our guests do the pairings because that's the reputation that we've really built strongly in that dining room. And for those who don't know Topolo Bampo, it's our fine dining restaurant. And I think because people are so puzzled by the idea of wine with Mexican food, they don't understand how beautifully it matches, that's a really great entry into showing them not only does wine work with our food, but perfect together. And so that we always try to introduce Mexican wines through that realm. But I think the number one way is to offer by the glass. Well, that is a way of offering by the glass, but with the paired wines, they tend to be a little bit more expensive bottling because we're only pouring a 3-ounce pour, so we can run higher end bottles through that menu. But at all of our locations, we have at least 2 to 5 by the glass. At Leña Brava, since it's Baja cuisine, we have 5 different wines from Mexico by the glass. And in Frontera Topolo, on just the regular Frontera list, we have a white and a red. And then Bar Sotano, we have 4 different wines from Mexico by the glass. But I think that's a way to do it because it's just the buy-in is just a glass, before if they have questions, if they have doubts in their minds, at least you're getting them a glass and a taste of that Mexican wine where they don't have to buy the whole bottle yet. And then next time they come in, then they're asking more and more about it. And the feedback has been awesome. In our private dining sales, we constantly get requests for Mexican wines for private parties. We just had a party of 40 guests that had requested Mexican wine for their private event. And so I think once you get that glass in their hand and once you get them tasting these wines from Mexico, then the rest happens. Then they're all in.
That's great. That's very good to hear. And that was actually leading to my next question is how receptive have customers been to the Mexican wines? And I guess
Very
kind
much
of
so.
related to that is do you serve wines from other regions too?
In Mexico, well, now we're starting to get more availability. Yeah, well, like you said, Casa Madero, that's Paras Valley, so that's a different area. And then the beachy wines is Tecate. There's other regions in Mexico where they're making wine, Aguascalientes, and several other places, Querétaro. Uh, but the availability isn't great on a lot of those regions yet. And more than 90% of the wines being made in Mexico are coming from the Valle de Guadalupe or the Ensenada area, or what we would call Baja California, and it's Baja California Norte. So now, because there's these little offshoot valles, Valle de Santo Tomas, Ojos Negros, Valle de San Vicente, and San Antonio de las Minas, which is really encapsulated in the Valle de Guadalupe. But those are the 5 main valleys in and around Ensenada, which we would call BC or Baja California. And so now more and more we're seeing the designation on the labels of Valle de San Vicente, like some of the Lurton labels are San Vicente, because 100% of that fruit is coming from that valley. We're seeing some from Valle de Santo Tomas, and all of these are within 30 miles of Ensenada, of the Valle de Guadalupe, but they range in terms of distance from the ocean and in elevation. Ojos Negros, a lot of wineries are planting there because there's more water. As we know, it's a very arid area, so the rainfall is very minimal, but Ojos Negros is an area that gets a little bit more rainfall, and it's a little bit higher elevation. And then Santo Tomas is just 27 miles south of Ensenada and 11 miles only from the ocean, so a lot of windy, continual winds. And then San Vicente is probably the furthest. It's 57 miles south of Ensenada. So it's got a little bit less of a coastal breeze because it has a mountain range that kind of blocks it a little bit, so it's a little bit warmer and a little bit more clay soils down there. And then San Antonio de las Minas is a very small valley, like I said, sort of encapsulated in the Valle de Guadalupe. And for those who've never been to the region, the Valle de Guadalupe is 18 miles northeast of Ensenada. And so Ensenada is the port town. It's a very famous fishing area where they pull some of the best fish in the world from those waters, very, very cold waters. And so that is part of the reason that they have such a diurnal shift in the valle. It can be 100 degrees during the day and then 50 or 60 at night. Like it's that much of a drop at night because of the ocean influence, which the grapes love.
Yes, indeed. Jill, your knowledge of the wines and the regions is very impressive, and it makes me want to ask, how do you learn? Where do you find your information?
Well, if you look at there was a book written many years ago by Ralph Ami. I don't even know if it's in print anymore, but it was the Wines of Baja, and it was written in English, and so that taught me a lot. I go down there more than once a year, 2 to 3 times a year, just to do the research and to be in the area and to talk to the winemakers. If you go on the winery websites, there's a lot of information there. Both of the two of the importers that we mentioned, actually a lot of the importers I mentioned, Jose Pastor, Truly Fine Wines, they have great information about the area on their websites. I believe Tom does too on his La Competencia website. But I think mainly just gaining it over the years by traveling to the region and talking to the winemakers, and just seeking it out. I'll find the title of the book by Ralph Ami. We can post that if you like
Okay,
after,
yes, great
because
idea.
people right off the top of my head, I can't, of course, can't think of the title right now. But he was the author, and he did a lot of good work back in the day. Now, some of the info might be out of date at this point, but it's good basic knowledge of the history of the area, because it's a really super unique history of how the whole thing happened. And not only is it part of North American history, because as you stated earlier, it's the oldest winery in North America is located in Mexico. And part of those original cellars are there as part of Casa Madero today. Yeah, so certainly got a lot of history, and we wouldn't have grapes in California or in South America for that matter if they hadn't come through Mexico first.
Exactly. Great. And Jill, when you are traveling there, or even when you are just working with your wines in the United States, are you able to network with other restaurant owners interested in this, or do you find yourself kind of alone in this venture from the restaurant side?
Well, to be honest, we really didn't have availability as far as distribution until only a couple of years ago. So I think it's a relatively new category. People do call me to ask, and one of the good things is that many people who call to find out where I get the Mexican wines are calling from wine shops, from guests who said, "Hey, I had this wine at Topolo or Frontera. I really love it. How can I buy it? How can I find it?" And I think now more than ever, these wines are now becoming more available, because availability, as you mentioned, is still very, very limited. A lot of that reason is because of the water situation. And, the lower amounts of water you have, the less yields you're going to get. Not only that, but they've been suffering for years from drought. So there were wineries who, for a couple of years in a row, could not make wine from their vineyards because everything was completely dehydrated. There were vintages where their production was less than half because of these drought and water problems. Now that they've started to get some rain again over the last year and a half, things are going to look up. But a lot of that was simply availability. Like, there wasn't enough wine to spread the love.
Oh,
So that wasn't always something I wanted people to know, to be quite honest.
you
But
were hoarding
now
it.
that's changed. Now there's more wineries, more vineyards planted in regions with access to water in some of these other areas. And so that really has changed. And now there's more wine and enough for all of us.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you, Jill. We've got just 10 minutes left on our time today. Let me remind attendees, if you have any questions, feel free to ask questions using that little questions tab on your screen. We don't have any questions from attendees at the moment, Jill. So let me ask a question while we see if anyone else does. This is something that you and I touched on when we spoke yesterday, and that is pairings. Can you give me a couple of examples of some of your most successful or favorite pairings at Topolobampo?
Sure. I love the Casa de Piedra Espuma, the Espuma de Piedra, which is a sparkling wine Ugo makes from Barbera. It's a Blanc de Noir, and it is fabulous with ceviche. I forgot also to mention another one of my favorite winemakers who I visited. The three that I visited back in '01 were Ugo de Costa at Casa de Piedra. Then he was also the winemaker, as I mentioned, at Adobe Guadalupe. And then the third was Paolo Paoloni, who has a winery called Villa Montefiore. And he, like Camilo, is originally from Italy, but makes really amazing wines. And he has a lot of his own, well, he has all of his own vineyards and very good mountain-fed spring water that is right up behind his property. So his wines are really great. He does Aglianico, Nebbiolo, a really great Sangiovese Rosé and the Sangiovese Grosso, as well as Cab Merlot and that sort of thing as well. But his wines, he was one of the top three, I thought, back in the day, and has maintained that quality since 2000 was when I first knew his wines. But I think he started there in the late 90s, as did Adobe Guadalupe, and it's just making fantastic wine. I think that some of the richness of ripe fruit in the reds coming from the region are really great with the moles. So if you're talking about mole negro or mole coloradito, where you've got some fruit and a little sweetness in the mole, you can do some of these blends that they're doing there with garnacha. They have amazing garnacha, carañena. Those are the really old vines there. And also some of the Zin blends that I've seen from the different wineries are really great with that as well. Paralelo is one of Ugo's offshoot wineries, and he does Ensemble, which is a blend of Merlot, Cabernet, Petit Syrah, Barbera, and Zinfandel, talking about some of the crazy blends. He does two different bottlings of Ensemble, Arenal, which is sand, and that's from the sandy valley floor. It's his same blend is exactly the same varieties. The other bottling is called Colina, which means hill, and that's from the clay hillsides. And so these are the exact same blends, Arenal and Colina. One is very, very light in body, and the other is more rich in body. And it's really interesting to see those bottlings next to each other because you can get a sense of the terroir of the valley. And those are super fun blends, and they work really great with the moles as well. If you're doing the moles that have maybe raisin and plantain and some of the fruitier, sweeter spices in the blends.
That sounds great. I can imagine, because moles are so popular and wine blends are so popular in Mexico, they make an excellent pairing. Great, Jill. We don't have any other questions, so I think let's wrap this up.
Excellent.
Let me thank you very much for your time today, and attendees, thank you very much for tuning in. This webinar has been recorded, and it will be posted on the Restaurante website later today. So you're welcome to watch it again, and we'll probably use some excerpts of the transcripts from this event in articles, at the very least on the website and perhaps in the magazine as well. So there are opportunities for you to view this again and learn more from the outstanding information that Jill has provided today. So Jill, thank you again, and thank you attendees. This webinar is now over.
Thank you, Ed.